we take magnesium orally, we'll absorb it through the GI tract, some in the upper GI, so the small intestine, some in the colon. That'll make the amount that goes into our circulation go up slightly, but magnesium is really tightly controlled. So what that means is that our kidneys will choose to either hold on to some more or release more, like waste some away in urine. And as we get older, both the absorption part suffers. Older people struggle in many types of absorption. There, again, dysbiosis, right? Like that, there's lots of challenges in the GI tract. But then the other thing classically you see as people get older is they waste more magnesium in the urine. They're just simply not, their kidneys aren't working as well to hold on to it, and to almost think of it as the kidneys, the gatekeeper for how much magnesium we waste out a day.
Collective Insights is a voyage through topics and technologies revolutionizing human well-being. Groundbreaking approaches for a better world and a better life await you. Welcome to Collective Insights.
Hi, this is Dr. Greg Kelly, VP of Product Development at Qualia and Doctor of Naturopathic Medicine. Did you know roughly 50% of people are deficient in magnesium? That's concerning because magnesium is one of the most vital minerals to human health, supporting brain health, healthy aging, bone health, heart health, metabolism, sleep, and more. But getting enough magnesium from our diet can be challenging. Allow me to introduce you to our new formula, Qualia Magnesium Plus. Qualia Magnesium Plus combines 9 forms of magnesium, along with 70 minerals and trace minerals that support magnesium actually being retained and used well in the body. With this approach, Qualia Magnesium Plus raises the bar on magnesium supplementation. At Qualia, we formulate products we want to take, and I invite you to experience the benefits we're seeing for ourselves. Go to qualialife.com/magnesium and enter code magnesium at checkout for an additional 15% off your order. That's qualialife.com/magnesium with code magnesium. Enjoy today's episode.
Hey, I'm James Schmackenberger. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Qualia Life Sciences, and I'll be your host of Collective Insights today. Today, I am joined by Dr. Gregory Kelly. Greg is a longtime naturopathic physician. He's the author of a book called Shapeshift and also happens to be the head of research and development for Qualia. Greg, thanks for joining.
Oh, super excited to be here today and geek out over magnesium.
Yeah, this is an exciting topic. So today's episode will all be a deep dive into everything you might ever want to know about magnesium. We're launching our own magnesium product here shortly, so we'll give some explanation about the product itself, but also just a deep understanding of the benefits and uses of magnesium. So I guess to get started, Greg, with us choosing to produce a magnesium product, what is the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah, so I think the simplest sense is that magnesium is this combination of crazy important. It's used in 600 plus enzymes. It directly touches on the 2 things that we're most interested in at Qualia, which is brain health and longevity. There was a study not too long ago that connected magnesium to all 12 hallmarks of aging as an example, and its impact on the brain has been known about for a long time. So crazy important. And then it's one of, if not the most common nutritional inadequacy. You could probably say vitamin D is, at least for some subsets of the population based on where they live. And so it just turns out that somewhere I've seen any numbers anywhere between 50 and 80% of the population in the US don't remotely come close to meeting their needs for magnesium. So that's the problem. And we can go a little bit into why that people struggle so much to meet it. But it kind of comes down to 2 things. Like, we need consistent amount of magnesium, and we have to get it from one of 2 places: food we eat or water we drink. Food, for a while, and people are fairly well aware of this, because of mineral depletion in soil, food processing, you lose a lot of magnesium from the plant foods, which are the best food sources of it. And then I don't see this talked about as much, but we would have evolutionarily got probably at least 20% of our magnesium from what you can think of as hard water, but mineral-rich water. And now, because so many health-conscious people either drink bottled water that's been purified or have home systems like reverse osmosis that strip out 90 to 98% of minerals, many of us just really don't get any magnesium to speak of in our water anymore. So the input, like just struggles.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't remember the specifics, but I do remember seeing a study a few years ago that was looking at the levels of different vitamins and minerals in produce, basically, currently versus like 50 years ago. And in many cases, and magnesium in particular, if I remember correctly, it was like less than 50% the amount of magnesium that is available in produce as it exists today versus not even all that long ago.
Yeah, and it's, a lot of that is because of agricultural processes, depleting the soil of the minerals, but also for plants to take up minerals, they need essentially microscopic organisms like bacteria on their root systems to then bring those inorganic substances up and turn them into organic forms of magnesium. And poor soil quality also means less microbes in the soil. So it's right on the money. Those kind of studies are consistent.
Yeah. Wait, so you said that somewhere between 50 and 80% of people are suspected to have like suboptimal levels of magnesium, which is significant. What would be sort of the most common signs? What would people experience if they're low on magnesium?
Yeah, so there's some functional medicine MDs tend to use something that's often described as, I think it's the magnesium status questionnaire, might be the name of it. What they do is they just look through some common diet and lifestyle areas and then some symptoms, like subjectively how people feel, to get a sense whether someone is or isn't meeting their magnesium needs. And so on the subjective symptom area, common things would be with mood. So like unpredictable mood swings, or periodic low moods, or kind of apathy, right? Like trouble just getting, motivated for things. You also see a lot of things that start to fall in that irritable, anxious type of spectrum of mood as well. Then you also see sleep issues are super common. Magnesium's really important for sleep. So that's another big one. Then you have what I think of as all the muscular things. So they can be anything from muscle cramps, sometimes on their own, sometimes after exercise or during exercise, kind of twitching of muscles. That's another super common clue that you might need more magnesium. And then sometimes even tingly type of sensation. So those are the muscle nerve type of cluster. And then another cluster can be GI, like tendency both towards like, loose stools or hard stools. So, both of those spectrums often can suggest someone needs more magnesium in their diet. And then the last area I would say has to do more with why we created Qualia Mind originally, right? That grouping of nootropic-y type things like focus and brain fog and that type of thing often clusters together when people need magnesium. So it wouldn't be uncommon, like back when I was in practice, for almost everyone to have one or more of those things that would suggest, like magnesium should be part of what we're doing to support you.
That makes sense. I mean, a lot of the things that you just described there are some of the most common struggles that I think almost everyone deals with, at least one of, if not multiple of those.
Oh, yeah. And then there's, many things that then exacerbate our needs. So if we just start to think diet, lifestyle, people that exercise, it's a known fact they need more magnesium intake because they sweat out more. So they lose more magnesium. And then alcohol, frequent drinkers, they also are impacted by their magnesium levels. And then when you get into things like, someone's heard they should take calcium, but they're taking it without magnesium. So they're probably now also impacting their magnesium status. And then I don't see this one talked about as much, but in research, it would be called the magnesium stress vicious cycle. So one of the things when we're stressed by anything, right? So emotional stress, financial stress, taking care of loved ones, so caregiver stress, you name it, is that part of the response to that is our cells dump magnesium from inside to outside. It just seems like part of the stress response. But then what can happen if that stress continues, we're kind of wasting, like think of intracellular magnesium, we're losing that. And we need magnesium inside cells to be more resilient. So we get caught in this vicious cycle or this loop of, we're wasting more magnesium, but we needed that magnesium to be more resilient. And now we're not resilient, so we're wasting even more magnesium. So, for listeners, if stress moderate to high is an issue, that's almost always going to be a clue that you should up your magnesium intake.
Right. So in a situation like that, where someone has a high degree of stress and that's causing kind of a constant, say, depletion of magnesium, how much of an impact can taking more have, and how much do people need to find ways to actually reduce the stress? I mean, obviously it's a both, but just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so magnesium on its own will often help people feel like they're under less stress. So we did that even in a pilot study. One of the questionnaires we used in exploring the Qualia magnesium product was a stress questionnaire. And what we saw in that small study is that over the course of taking the magnesium, people reported that they felt less stressed. So magnesium tends to dampen down our feelings of stress. It helps us be more resilient to that stress. And we always want to do as much as we can to mitigate stress no matter what, right? Like stress, you and I would know, and I'm sure almost every listener, is really kryptonite for our health, right? So it just weakens across the board. And what you generally see is we all would have Achilles heels of sorts, because of past injuries, trauma, genetics, you name it. And stress tends to find those and exacerbate them.
Yeah. I wasn't planning on going into this, but it makes me think of, one of the reasons that I have had such a deep fascination with supplementation is kind of this idea of virtuous cycles versus vicious cycles. So if someone is stressed, there's then the propensity to make worse lifestyle choices to feel better from the stress. You want to eat more sugar, you're too stressed to sleep, so you sleep less, which drives more stress, right? And then that just creates more and more stress. And obviously, if someone's got a high degree of stress, it's important to look at what's happening in terms of lifestyle, what's happening psychologically, and properly address it. But this is where I think supplementation becomes super interesting, is that if you've got a high degree of stress and you can take magnesium, which will limit the experience of stress, having a lower degree of felt stress then makes it easier to make better lifestyle choices, which then helps create an actual underlying solution for what's causing the problem.
Yeah, I 100% agree. In fact, one of the simple tricks I used to use with patients back when I was in practice was to have them just do what we call paced breathing at the time, but just breathe in for 5 seconds, out for 5 seconds, do that for 5 minutes, ideally twice a day, or immediately after you feel like, all right, I've been knocked off center, I feel stressed, when you get enough back to balance that you can think about integrating a quick breathing exercise. And that often just doing that for a while, over the course of days to weeks, then all of a sudden they would report back like, oh, I'm now doing better in this completely unrelated thing. Right. So yeah, like we always want to, as you said, if there's a vicious cycle, interrupt it and put in place a virtuous cycle. And magnesium can be that for some people.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I find that aspect fascinating, slightly off topic, but for me, that was one of the things that was so powerful with originally creating Qualia Mind. And really in terms of my own experience and then later what I saw in lots and lots of people was that being exhausted, burned out, all of those kinds of things, it made it really hard to make the right choices because there just wasn't energy. And being able to take Mind all of a sudden offset that in a really powerful way, where now all of a sudden I had the energy to be able to choose to exercise, to be able to choose better diet, right? And so it was beneficial in and of itself, but it actually supported and drove progressively better behavior. And I've now watched that across lots of people, and I hadn't thought about it previously around magnesium, but it seems like there's a really clear correlation there.
Yeah, definitely agree.
So let's go a little bit more into some of the challenges that people experience with the lack of magnesium and some of the benefits that happen when magnesium levels are healthy. You touched on this idea that magnesium has an impact on multiple hallmarks of aging, but I'm curious if you can say more on that.
Yeah, so I mentioned starting that magnesium is involved in more than 600 different enzyme reactions in the body. So when you think of hallmarks of aging, we'll just hit a few of them because, I want to cover a lot of things. But one of those is keeping DNA healthy, right? Repairing DNA, making sure it copies itself well, that's like essentially genetics. And it turns out magnesium just plays a really prominent role in allowing both DNA to do its job and then repairing it. So it's important for that hallmark. Another one has to do with dysbiosis, right? Which has essentially the microbiota, the gut organisms that live there, and our overall barrier function tend to go predictably in a poor direction as we get older. And it turns out that just like us, bacteria need magnesium. And we need magnesium for barrier function, whether that's the gut barrier or the blood-brain barrier. So, it ticks the box for that one as well. Third one is mitochondrial dysfunction. And mitochondria do more than this, but they're best known for being our cellular powerhouses, making something called ATP. And so if we just take, glucose molecules or carbohydrate molecules as an example, to turn those into energy, ATP, one glucose molecule is going to give you somewhere between 30 and 38 molecules of ATP. And the first step is to what's called glycolysis. But for listeners, that's just starting the breakdown of these sugar molecules into something that can eventually be more directly turned into ATP. And there's 11 steps in that first breakdown thing. Magnesium is used in 5 of them, right? So metabolizing sugars, we don't have enough magnesium, that's going to struggle. And then from there, things go into what's called the Krebs cycle. From there, they're fed into what's called oxphos in the mitochondria membrane. So magnesium is also involved in a few things along that. The key thing is about a third of the magnesium inside our cells is inside mitochondria. And one of the main reasons is for ATP to be active, it's always bound to or complexed with magnesium. Right. So whenever you hear ATP, think ATP magnesium or magnesium ATP. It's without one, you don't have the other. So for ATP to do its job, which, that is what allows our cells to do a lot of the work to keep us healthy and give us energy, we need magnesium. Right. So those are just 3. But we could go through the other 9 and you'd also have the reason biochemically why magnesium and good magnesium status are so important for healthy aging. And then the last piece before we move on to something else is that as we get older, we struggle to both absorb and retain magnesium. So what you would classically see in an older person is just poorer magnesium status, all things being equal with someone that was younger.
Actually, can you speak to that more? I've heard that, but I'm not familiar with what it is that happens that causes people to absorb and retain magnesium more poorly as they age.
Yeah, so we'll get maybe more into bioavailability in a second, but we take magnesium orally, we'll absorb it through the GI tract, some in the upper GI, so the small intestine, some in the colon. That'll make the amount that goes into our circulation go up slightly, but magnesium is really tightly controlled. So what that means is that then our kidneys, will choose to either hold on to some more or release more, like waste some away in urine. And as we get older, both the absorption part suffers. Older people struggle in many types of absorption. They're, again, dysbiosis, right? Like that, there's lots of challenges in the GI tract. But then the other thing classically you see as people get older is they waste more magnesium in the urine. They're just simply not, their kidneys aren't working as well to hold on to it and to almost think of it as the kidneys, the gatekeeper for how much magnesium we waste out a day.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. A couple of things that you mentioned to me previously that I wanted to see if you could touch on, because they were things I didn't know and I found them fascinating. One was, you talked to me about a study that correlated the amount of magnesium to brain size.
Yeah, so I think the study was in 2023. We have a blog on our website about it. But what they did is they looked, I think it was about 6,000 plus people, and measured changes in brain volume. So they looked at gray matter, white matter, hypothalamus, lesions in white matter. And what they found is the people that had higher dietary intakes of magnesium, and I think 550 milligrams was the number that they put in the study, had more gray volume, more hypothalamus, and fewer lesions in the white matter. So fundamentally speaking, their brain was just much, much healthier. And I think they started to track those people in their mid-40s. My recollection is the studied population was, say, mid-40s, so 45-ish through like 60s. As we would know at Qualia, magnesium and the brain are like hand in glove. You
right.
Absolutely need adequate magnesium status to have good brain function. And that just gets more notable as we get older.
Yeah. It's fascinating getting to learn more about this. I mean, I've obviously had familiarity with magnesium for years, but I think a lot of the common understanding that people have is that magnesium's good for sleep, stress, maybe some muscle stuff and GI stuff, right? Which are all key, but like from what you're sharing and from some of the other conversations we've had, it really seems like magnesium's one of the more critical things for almost every organ and every function in the body.
Yeah, I know you and I at your house maybe 2 months ago were talking about something you hadn't heard of, and it's magnesium's connection to hearing and noise stress. And so for listeners, I was an officer in the Navy before becoming a naturopathic doctor. So this was 84 through 89. And specifically, I worked in engineering for my first 3 years. And in the engineering spaces on the ship are loud. They're also hot, but they're loud. And so hearing loss was a big issue, even at that point when I was in the Navy. And we would, if me or the people that worked for me were in the engineering spaces, we would do something called double hearing protection, which meant those soft, squishy earplugs, you would put them in, and then you would put those hard shells over your ears, the ones you might see like the old Top Gun movie, the people on the flight deck wearing, right? So that was double hearing protection. And then the Navy would routinely measure. It was one of the things I think maybe every year I had to go to a hearing assessment and have my hearing looked at. And so long story short, noise, has been known for a long time to be something that really stresses our hearing and can make us susceptible to losing that. And that also then starts to play into aging, because both vision and hearing, if those start to go downhill, that really accelerates people's aging and how they function with aging. So long story short, in the early 90s, by then, scientists had figured out that magnesium played a really important role in allowing our hearing to be resistant to noise stress. And including, so there was animal studies, then eventually about 4 or 5 human studies, and they all used this one form of magnesium that I think is just so underappreciated, and it's magnesium aspartate. And in each of these human studies, making sure that magnesium status was optimized allowed us to be resilient to stress that otherwise would have very dramatically impacted our hearing. And that's even, I think, it's as important as it was when I was an officer in the Navy. It's important in a lot of people's lives today because of technology. Right? Back in my Navy time, classically, other than people that worked in loud occupations, it was musicians or people that worked as roadies in a band that would get their hearing really overwhelmed by noise stress.
So, what you're speaking to now is the piece that I found so interesting, was that noise-induced hearing issues have been around forever, but like you said, they were a bit more narrow. In the last chunk of years, you now have a situation where almost everyone in the population is wearing either headphones or earbuds for like hours every day. And that means that the sound is being delivered from a much closer range and oftentimes is at a volume designed to tune out outside sounds as well. So loud enough that it has the potential to create damage. So it seems like, we're now living in a society where there's an almost ubiquitous impact negatively affecting hearing. And yet it's something that doesn't seem to be getting talked about much, nor do solutions seem to be getting talked about.
Yeah. So I think that's, one of the, as you started, like people seem to be well aware of magnesium for muscle cramps or sleep or for stress. And the hearing piece, almost like even you follow the biohacker space, and that was new to you when I shared that research.
Yeah. Well, I remember one of the other things that you mentioned to me when we started talking about this was that, not only is magnesium like an effective thing in that regard, but it's likely the most effective thing for being able to support hearing loss related to excessive noise.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. The human studies were back in the early 90s, I believe, and there's been very little that's been studied in the 30 plus years to show that it would work anywhere remotely as consistently as magnesium does for noise stress.
Right. Okay, so another question I had that I wanted to touch on is, if magnesium deficiency is so prevalent, does it kind of continue to go unnoticed or unrealized for most individuals? You had made the reference to me before regarding how it's typically tested for, and that was also new for me.
Yeah, so when I would have been in practice, if I was going to test for magnesium, I would have probably run a red blood cell test for magnesium status. But classically, the most common way is in plasma, right? So like in circulation, but outside of blood cells. And both of those at this point in time are fairly well known to have almost no correlation to the magnesium that's actually inside our tissues. So this may be news to listeners, but it's a lot more work to get something inside cells than into circulation. So the way I would describe it is think of the idea of resistance. So many listeners will know the idea of insulin resistance, right? So got more than enough insulin in circulation, yet it's not able to get inside cells and do its job. And I remember, so this goes back to around 2000. I was doing a project with a good buddy, Mark Percival. He's been on Collective Insights in the past. And Mark's what I would think of as a true short sleeper, meaning I need about 8 hours to feel like I'm ready to go. Mark's always been someone that needs less than that, but he needs more than he used to think he needs. So around 2000, he was, I only need 4 hours of sleep kind of person. And I remember, I think we were like doing a project together in the LA area. We were staying at Redondo in an apartment the company had rented for us. And about 6 a.m, the first day, Mark wakes me up. He's like, let's go rollerblading. And I'm like, dude, come back in another hour and a half. And so we started talking later that day. He's like, oh, yeah, I don't need much sleep. Like, I'm great on 4 hours. And I'm like, oh, well, tell me more. He's like, yeah, no, I do really great. The only thing I've noticed is I need a lot of magnesium compared to normal people. Otherwise, I get really bad muscle cramps. And so I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. By the way, have you ever seen this study that when we're sleep deprived, magnesium can't get into our cells? Right? So maybe you don't need like crazy high amounts of magnesium. You just need a little more sleep so that the magnesium you are getting can actually get inside its cells and prevent these cramps, right? So that fundamentally would be akin to having magnesium resistance, right? So, think it's not as common in our world because our world, people wear Oura rings or other trackers and pay close attention to their sleep and do things like Qualia night to try to optimize it. But in, a lot of society, sleep is still a struggle. And I believe that there is stress we already mentioned, right? That vicious cycle. But I think there's probably many things that kind of cause that issue with magnesium resistance. There's some in circulation. It's just not getting in tissues. And the crazy thing that I saw when I was reviewing research for magnesium is tissue levels of magnesium are almost never measured. Almost never. So if I read 1,000 magnesium studies, in 5 of them did they measure tissue levels in any tissue, never mind multiple tissues, right? And in those, going back to your question, the amount in circulation or in red blood cells had literally no correspondence to what was in tissues or what caused it to go up when magnesium was supplemented. Some forms of magnesium, like as an example, magnesium malate's really widely used. And I always see that positioned as one of the most bioavailable magnesiums. So one of the studies that measured tissue levels measured brain, muscle, also measured plasma, red blood cell. Magnesium malate did a great job on plasma and red blood cells and didn't increase muscle or brain levels of magnesium at all, right? So there's a huge difference between what classically someone would say, it's bioavailable, versus what actually matters. Did it go up in tissue levels? And then what matters even more, did it do what it's supposed to do? So like in Dr. Greg's brain, the most important criteria is, did something do what it was supposed to do? And magnesium, let's go back to that hearing example. All right, did we take some form of magnesium and did it help our hearing, right? And if the answer is yes, okay, that magnesium did what it was supposed to do. And if someone says, well, you use my magnesium because it's more bioavailable, it's like, but does it do what it's supposed to do, right? Did it make something go up in tissues? Because those are just so much more important than that bioavailability story.
I want to go a little bit deeper on that because this is actually one of the most common things that I see talked about in the field, right? Almost all influencers, lots of product companies are, like you said, touting the importance of, how bioavailable the magnesium is. But then the challenge you're expressing is that even if it is bioavailable, it's based on a testing methodology that isn't really relevant. So are there areas in which this idea of bioavailability, at least as it pertains to magnesium, really do matter? Or is it pretty much, is most or all of the influence really more in how much of it's able to get into tissue?
Yeah, let's start with, what do you think bioavailability means?
Well, I mean, there's sort of the technical answer, but I'll give what I think when I first heard that, like what my initial impression is that something being more bioavailable means that it's getting better absorption and better utilization for the body.
Yeah. And so I think that would be how most people think about it, that combination, right? Absorption, utilization. When I'm pitched ingredients by vendors, quite often it's like, oh, buy ours because ours is more bioavailable. And what usually they're looking at is like it went up more in the blood. So like, and then the assumption is it was more used or it did more of what it was supposed to do. But that's an assumption, right? Like, and one thing that I've learned in the 30 years plus since I started naturopathic school in 93 is that assumptions when it comes to something as complex as our body are usually not worth the thought process that went into them, right? So what at the end of the day matters is, did it work, right? And bioavailability at most is a means to that end, at most, right? And now let's go into what science means when they say, like, oh, we did this bioavailability study on magnesium. And the most common way that would be measured is that they would give a single dose of magnesium, probably a couple of different magnesiums, but let's just say one in the study. And then they're going to measure, like, all right, how much did it change in plasma would be the most common thing. And that's so tightly regulated that it's almost meaningless, right? Like any magnesium is going to cause an abrupt increase in magnesium in the plasma. But then our kidney's job is to make sure that stays tightly controlled. So it'll go up. And if it goes up like a little bit too much, then they'll just pee out more magnesium, right? So that idea of, or that way to measure bioavailability in plasma just has, like I said, no correspondence to what's going on in tissues or whether magnesium's working. And then a more sophisticated study may say, okay, well, we'll measure what happened in blood and then how much was urinated out. And if we give more, so we give these two magnesiums, this one more went out in the urine, so presumably more was absorbed, so it was more bioavailable. Now, there's all kinds of issues with that, right? Like, first and foremost, you just lost more magnesium, right? So even if more was absorbed, you lost that, and maybe even more, right? So we could spend probably a half hour getting listeners up to speed on bioavailability, but the way it's classically measured in the studies that my vendors would use to me to pitch me their magnesiums, it's just like, LOL, this is ridiculous. This just doesn't give any useful information. And so if you really wanted to measure something, what you would do is first and foremost tissue. But if you didn't do that, you'd do what's called retention. And the way they classically would measure retention is they're going to put isotopes, something radioactive, on magnesium molecules and then trace what happens to that after you take it orally. And what they'll often do is, okay, you took it orally, how much then passed out in fecal matter, right, that wasn't absorbed? And then how much then over the next hours was passed out in urine? And the difference would be what was retained, right? And retention matters more, right? If it's retained, at least now it's got a shot at getting into tissues. And so in retention studies, what you see is some of the ones we chose, right? The magnesium glucuronate, the magnesium aspartate, ones that are thought to be really bioavailable, like magnesium citrate. Those are also really well retained. So, that retention piece for listeners is way more important than bioavailability. And then at the end of the day, the most important thing is still, did it get into tissues? And it's just harder than we think to get things, even when they're retained, into tissues. So let's go with the brain as an example. So I'll let you mention the original product that you and your brother spent a year making. 2 years.
Yeah. So the very first product that we launched was kind of the predecessor to what most people are now familiar with as Qualia Mind, but it was a 2-part product instead of one bottle. It was designed to have capsules that you took first thing in the morning on an empty stomach, and then the second formula that was taken either with breakfast or lunch. It's a really spectacular formula, but having it broken out into 2 different pieces, even though there was relevance in terms of the effect of certain ingredients based on being empty stomach or with food, just turned out to be too difficult for most people to remember. And as great of a product as it was, I think we overshot capsule count a little bit. It ended up being a 12 capsule product. And that was fine for some people, but not for the majority of people. But yeah, I know magnesium was something that we had included in that original version and spent quite a bit of time then looking at it.
I asked you to mention it because the magnesium in it was something called magnesium L-threonate. And so we were still making what we refer to as OG Qualia sometimes, or two-step. When I first joined, we were Neurohacker Collective then before we became Qualia Life. And the reason that form was because you and your brother had learned that, that one is the brain magnesium, right? And what was actually true in those couple animal studies they did on that magnesium threonate is it caused magnesium to go up in cerebral spinal fluid, CSF, which isn't quite the brain, but, nervous system. And so that one, compared to some of the other bioavailable ones, just did a better job at getting, presumably, into the nervous system. And then much more recently, there's something called magnesium acetyltaurate. And so that magnesium even went beyond. They actually studied brain tissue in animals. And in one of their studies that I read, they compared magnesium, we'll just say ATA magnesium, the acetyltaurate, magnesium citrate, magnesium glycinate, and magnesium malate, and then looked what happened in muscle tissue and the brain. And what they found is that magnesium acetyltaurate at a really low dose caused the brain levels of magnesium to go up and become more optimized. Magnesium citrate and magnesium glycinate, or bisglycinate, they're synonyms. Those also did, but it took more magnesium bound to those to get to the same amount of magnesium in the brain. And magnesium malate just didn't move the needle at all. So that is one of the reasons we have this magnesium acetyltaurate in Qualia magnesium. And what it turns out, I joke sometimes on X, like the old Twitter, that there's magnesium X, right? Which this sub pocket of people that are just crazy magnesium people that self-experiment with different magnesium, share their things. And that form of magnesium just tends to be experienced as a really calming type of magnesium, which makes sense. It actually gets into the brain. So what magnesium is bound to seems to make a big difference, potentially, in getting into certain tissues. And finishing up that magnesium acetyltaurate study, it was completely ineffective at moving the needle on muscle magnesium. It just didn't for that tissue. So something about that form allowed it to get VIP entry to the brain, but rejected from the muscle. But mag citrate was able to, at the higher amounts used in the study, increase magnesium, both muscle and the brain. It was sometimes what I would say is the versatile magnesium. And magnesium glycinate, which we generally think of in the biohacker space as a great form for sleep and mood, moved the needle on the brain, but again, was rejected from muscle tissues. And magnesium malate was left outside the club in both cases. Didn't get in, right? So, which is why we didn't use that form. So not a lot of studies, like I mentioned, have measured tissue levels. But if you're moving the needle there, then invariably magnesium is going to do what it was supposed to do. When I hear a marketer or see a brand like, oh, we have the most bioavailable form of magnesium, it's like, oh, that's so 90s. Can we talk about something important?
Right. I mean, what you're speaking to right now is one of the things that I'm really grateful for in your approach to research and formulation, is that in the field, there's a lot of people who do research, but then there's also just these like common narratives that come about, whether that's because, an ingredient manufacturer did good marketing, or, some popular person misunderstood a thing and shared it, and then a bunch of people repeated it. Like there's all kinds of various reasons, but there's so often there's like these stories of what an ingredient is good for or why that actually don't correlate to the underlying research. But then taking the time to find all of the, you mentioned like 1,000 studies that, you went through for this product, taking the time to actually find all of those, to read them all in detail and understand them, it allows for the creation of products that have a much higher likelihood of actually doing the intended outcome. And it's just not common even amongst the people in the space who tend to care most.
Yeah, well, I'm fortunate I get to work for you, and you enable me to have the time, and my team to do deep dives into things. So that's a luxury a lot of supplement companies just frankly don't have, right? They're tasked with churning out a lot of products in a small amount of time. And so they don't, even if they had the desire and skill, they might not have the time afforded to them, which, like I said at Qualia, I'm really lucky that you afford us that. But a lot of times it's people don't know what they don't know either, right? So Tim Urban, he was on Collective Insights with Jamie Wheel. I might be mispronouncing Jamie's last name. And I love Tim Urban. One of my favorite models of his has the Child Hill analogy. But basically the gist of it is it's the Dunning-Kruger effect, but unskilled and unaware of it. And Tim Urban's then drawing of that is there's, people on the Child Hill. And when you're on the Child Hill, you think you know everything or a huge amount, but you don't know enough to know what you don't know. And then as you learn more, you descend into his valley of ignorance. And that's where you're like, oh, I'm a complete poser. And sometimes I hear you like talking like that, but you're clearly in the valley of ignorance. But that's a good place to know. That means you've learned now enough that you've moved off the Child Hill. And then if you stick with something, then you start to actually ascend the hill of knowledge. And, what happens, unfortunately, is many well-intentioned people are just because they don't know what they don't know, they're on the Child Hill. But then they have big audiences and teach a whole bunch of people wrong things. So,
right. Yeah. No, it's a great analogy. Okay, so you already kind of started talking about this, but I think one of the most common things that I hear in the field when people are interested in magnesium is what form to take. And, you spoke to some of them, but I think it'd be good to just give a better picture on that. Like, how many forms of magnesium are there? Are they all equally relevant and just better for different use cases? How, without spending, 6 hours giving a deep dive on every single form, like how would people think about forms of magnesium in a useful way?
Yeah, just off the top of my head, and like with a spreadsheet that I have in our science department, there's somewhere between 2 and 3 dozen forms of magnesium. Like some aren't really magnesium supplements, magnesium stearate as an example, right? It's used in tableting and as an excipient sometimes. Then there's a fair amount of those, say 28-ish types of magnesium have no studies on them, right? They exist. Like I've seen magnesium ascorbate. So like magnesium vitamin C complex, which seems like a good idea, but there's no studies on it. And then, so you start to narrow down the list and you're probably now like maybe a dozen or less that have been studied for some outcome in humans. And a few of those almost not at all, like magnesium malate, despite that's wide use, the bioavailability story. I think I saw one human study that used magnesium malate. It's just not much studied where, other things like magnesium chloride, crazy favorite in magnesium X. There's lots of studies on humans giving magnesium chloride, which is usually thought of, that's not a great magnesium. It's not as bioavailable. Just a story. But magnesium chloride actually works. And it's one of the reasons that we have a concentrated seawater source of minerals in Qualia Magnesium Plus, because the form in that particular magnesium ingredient is magnesium chloride, along with about 65 trace minerals, which are also important. So what's classically, the way it's usually sliced and diced is you would have inorganic forms of magnesium, and that has nothing to do with organic food, and organic forms. And what inorganic means, it's magnesium oxide or magnesium sulfate or magnesium chloride, basically magnesium bound to some other mineral or something else on the periodic table, right? Inorganic. And then magnesium organic forms are something that has a carbon molecule. So, these are your amino acid forms like glycinate or taurate or acetyltaurate, or magnesium bound to Krebs cycle intermediates like citric acid or malic acid. So your citrates and malates, or something like bound to creatine. Super cool, right? Because creatine's crazy important nutrient. So those are the organic forms. And of those, some have been studied for some things and others maybe for other things. So I mentioned magnesium aspartate. The only magnesiums really that have been looked at for hearing are magnesium aspartate and magnesium chloride. So we have both in Qualia Magnesium because hearing to me and to you is really important. We want to make sure we're protecting people from noise stress. Then you have things like I mentioned, the magnesium acetyltaurate, which seems to me as much as magnesium threonate has this reputation as the brain magnesium, I think over time, we'll come to think, oh, magnesium acetyltaurate is the real magnesium. And so I personally think sometimes the stories about this magnesium's better than that are maybe played up more than they merit based on the science. But there is science that shows some are just better than other for certain uses or for certain tissues. And I tend to, when it comes to my health, think the same way about it I think about my financial well-being. I want to take a smart portfolio approach to both, right? I don't want to put all my money in Bitcoin as much as I love Bitcoin. I don't want to just eat well and ignore sleep and stress and exercise and supplementation. I want a portfolio. And so that portfolio approach just makes sense to me. And it's one of the things that colored our approach at Qualia to our magnesium supplement. We have a variety of 9 different forms, all of which are bioavailable, because I think of that as entry level, but then all known to be well retained, several that have actually now been studied in tissue retention and actually do move the needle. And then they do what they're supposed to do. Like they have human studies that show that they actually produce some beneficial outcome when we take those types of magnesiums. And at the end of the day, that's what matters, right? We don't take magnesium because we're hoping it's more bioavailable. We take it because we want to impact something that actually means something in our life subjectively.
So, all right. So with our product, so there's 9 different forms of magnesium that we're working with. And then in addition to that, there's also like 70 trace minerals. And I wanted to have you share on what was the importance of combining trace minerals with magnesium? What does that do differently?
Yeah, so I think water is crazy important, and many of our listeners will thumbs up. They get it. They're already doing what they can to improve their water quality. And I would have been in naturopathic school, one of those people back at the time. I carried a Nalgene bottle with me everywhere. And I worked at a food co-op that had reverse osmosis. I would fill the bottle, like every place that had good, like in my mind, good water quality at the time, and then drink water constantly. I was in the Phoenix area. So for listeners, like you lose a lot of water, but you also lose a lot of minerals. So what happened at that point in my life, I just didn't retain water. I would drink water, I would go to the bathroom. I would drink more water, I would go to the bathroom. It just was this loop, right? So I drank a lot of water, but I didn't retain it. And I was probably also, because it was reverse osmosis, demineralizing my teeth, my bones, my body, like losing more in my sweat than I was replacing. So long story short, at some point, different strategy. I haven't used a Nalgene bottle in 25 years. I drink water like meals. I bolus most of my water intake when I eat food, rather than sipping it through the day or having a glass every hour like I would have when I was younger. But when I was reading the magnesium research, one of the things that came up a number of times was studies that were magnesium-rich mineral water. And they were cool studies, right? Like not only bioavailability, but improving GI performance and other things. And I just thought, well, this is really sad. Like many of our listeners are taking steps to find purified or better water. And, I found a whole bunch of studies that measured minerals in the most common bottled waters, both mineral waters and purified waters in the U.S. market. And they were horribly low in both magnesium and trace minerals, almost bar none. Now, there were a few exceptions, like a Gerolsteiner. It's a really magnesium-rich water. And it just occurred to me, like, magnesium in nature would always come bundled with trace minerals, right? Like the hydrosphere, right? So water, the ocean, where we evolved, is crazy rich in all these trace minerals. And that many of them are ignored when it comes to research. Now, boron, as an example, isn't. We know boron helps our bones retain more magnesium, as an example. And so my thought was, in nature, we're always getting magnesium from food that's going to have trace minerals. If it was, like good soil, from water, it's always going to be from trace minerals. And I just thought, when I take my magnesium supplement, I want a portfolio of all the trace minerals as well. So let's give people that. And I think it's a smarter way to go about it. And so we have both a Aquamin, which is magnesium from seawater off the coast of Ireland, and then that concentrated seawater minerals. That's a magnesium chloride. And so we have 2 sources that, collectively have, or each on its own has 65 to 70 plus trace minerals.
Yeah, I really like the approach of mimicking nature. as science evolves, there are ways that we can do things to maybe augment the benefits of what already occur in nature. But I think we often overlook the importance of how nature works, and we try to reduce things to overly simplified approaches. But there's something, to be said for how the world and our biology evolved, and to recognize the importance of being able to intake nutrients in the way in which physiology seems to be oriented towards.
Yeah, if you think simply, like our cells and the mitochondria in them both evolved in the oceans way like millennia, right? Like a billion years ago or more, right? So they would have been surrounded with both magnesium-rich water, but water rich in, all the trace minerals. And you had asked earlier, like, why is it that people struggle so much with issues related to symptoms related to magnesium inadequacy? And I had mentioned that it's a lot easier even to improve magnesium in red blood cells or plasma than it is tissue levels. And that could be part of the puzzle, right? That we need the magnesium, but there's these trace minerals are doing things that science just hasn't spent the time to explore yet. And that, as an example, we know boron matters. We know lithium in trace amounts matters for magnesium retention and tissue levels. And my guess is we would find many others too. So, in the meantime, let's just do magnesium the way nature intended it.
Awesome. Well, we're starting to run short on time, but I wanted to see if you could share a little bit about what you saw in, I guess, your own experimentation with this product and with some of the study results.
Yeah, so the first beta study, and we're going to do another one now as well, we used the magnesium status questionnaire, or a subset of that had to do more with subjective things people experience. We used a stress scale, and we also had a sleep scale. And what we saw is that our portfolio approach to magnesium improved all three of those questionnaires. So at the time, I remember sharing that with you and like, wow, I didn't expect this good a response. And then for me, I actually go out of my way to drink magnesium-rich water, to not drink the purified waters. I just have a different strategy, even re-mineralize some of my water. But what I've noticed is an improvement in my aura. Well, I actually use a different ring now, but it would be an aura like sleep tracker. So that's what I've noticed. And I wouldn't have been someone that took a magnesium supplement before this project came up with Qualia. And I remember when I was first pitched it, I was a little bit like, oh, well, like happy to do it. And our team, several members on it, were like, I love taking magnesium supplement. I would so much like it if we could make an even better one that I could take. And after I did the research, I was like, oh, I want us to do a magnesium project as well, because we can do a better one than what most people have access to, maybe than what everyone has access to. Because sometimes I'll see stories about liposomal magnesium or sustained release magnesium. And it's like, well, those are just stories, right? All magnesium, in a sense, is sustained release. It takes, an hour after we take magnesium before it really starts to go up in circulation, and then won't peak till like 2 to 2.5 hours later, it starts to peak and then stays peaked for 5 hours, right? Like it's naturally sustained release, right? So, I see all these kind of gimmicky things with magnesium where it's like, let's just do the right amount in forms that we know are retained and get into tissues and that we know have made a difference when clinical studies have been done on them in humans. Let's put them with trace minerals because most of us aren't getting enough of them, both in our food and our water. And at the end of the day, it's one of the reasons I love working for you and Qualia is because we go the extra mile when it comes to making really great supplements.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I had a similar experience to you with this product, right? When the idea was first brought up to do magnesium, it didn't quite click for me, right? Because our sort of orientation as an organization is that we only work on products that either don't exist or where we can do something notably more effective than anything else we can find out there. And I had kind of always operated under the impression before diving into it that magnesium is magnesium. There might be some slight variants, but there wasn't really a big opportunity to innovate. And then once you and the team started researching, you started filling me in, it became clear that there actually was. Well, and for one, I learned so much that I didn't know about the importance of magnesium. but then also realized how so much of what does currently exist is largely a story and doesn't actually have the substantiation to back up retention, utilization, all these kinds of things. And so it became clear that there actually was an opportunity to do something innovative and meaningful, and really, really delighted to see this come into market.
Me as well.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. Greg, thank you. Having been in the field for many years, I still learn new and interesting things every time we talk. Grateful to get to have this conversation with you today. And for those listening, as a special thank you for tuning in today, I'd like to give you an additional 15% off if you want to try Qualia Magnesium Plus. Go ahead and go to qualialife.com/magnesium and use coupon code magnesium. That'll give you an additional 15% off. Thank you so much.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease, or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional, herbal, or homeopathic supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.